Welcome to our webinar on last minute prep for passing your Part 107 exam. Before we start today's review session, please be sure to mute yourself just to eliminate any background noise. I do want to mention that we are recording today's session just so I can send it out to everyone to review after it's over. And then if you're calling in, just go ahead and mute your phone. Also, if you have any questions during today's review session, please feel free to submit them in the chat section that's on the control panel on your screen. Or if you're calling in, you could go ahead and just wait until the Q&A session at the end. We will have an open Q&A session. So if you don't have any questions come up as we're reviewing, you could go ahead and just call out your questions at that time. So today's speaker is Colin Romberger. And just to give a quick background, Colin is a private pilot and advanced ground instructor. He holds a master's degree in UAS design and operations from Embry-Riddle. He also holds multiple FAA airman certificates for manned aircraft operations, and he currently owns and operates a drone services company in Pennsylvania, which he focuses on mapping and inspections. Also, to quickly mention, when today's review is over, I will be sending everyone a copy of this slide deck as well as the recorded webinar, so you can go back and review that material. So with that said, I'm going to pass things over to Colin and we will jump into today's review.
Great, thanks Alicia, appreciate it. Okay, so I'm sure most of you are already deep into your preparations for the exam, either your initial remote pilot exam or your recurrent, because we have had these regulations out now for just coming up on 3 years. So I know many folks are coming around to that biannual review exam as well. So make sure that you're taking the time to study. You want to be successful that first time, because as you can see, as we know, it does cost $150 every time you go to take that exam, pass or fail. Plus you have to wait 2 weeks before you can go back again if you aren't successful that first time. So make sure you're putting in the time. Again, most of our students tell us, total prep time that they're recording is between about 15 and 20 hours. So, make sure that you're comfortable with it. If you need help finding a test center, you can go to the FAA's website, just faa.gov, and in the search box at the top, just type in FAA Knowledge Test Centers, and it'll give you a list of sorted by state. There's close to 700 of them around the country, so you shouldn't have any problems finding one. And then make sure that once you take the test, they're going to give you a test report document once you leave the testing center. And as long as you pass, you'll have a reference number on there to a successful test score, and you can finish off the rest of the process to actually get your certificate 100% online. You'll go online to the FAA's IACRA website. You'll create an account. You'll start a new application for a new airman certificate. You'll link that reference number from the test report to that, and about a week later, you'll be able to print your temporary certificate. The permanent one usually comes in the mail about 45 to 60 days after you submit everything in IACRA. So as far as the topics for the test, we're going to take a look at some of the more challenging questions today that folks see on this exam. If you're taking it for the first time, you can see all 10 topics that are up there for you that they're going to be asking you questions on. Definitely the ones that are the most intensive, the ones related to reading our charts, our sectional charts, which we have sections for right up here: airspace classifications, flight restrictions, also a little bit about airport operations that falls into those charts, and then questions about weather, and also just the regulations themselves. Those are the big heavy hitting topics. For those of you going back for your second time for your recurrent exam, you will not have to answer questions about weather or SUAS loading and performance. Those questions have been removed from the shorter 40-question recurrent exam. All right, so let's get into some of our practice questions here so that we can get through these and make sure that we have a little time at the end if anyone has any questions. So the first one tells us, refer to figure 26 and area 2. What is the length of the runway at Cooperstown Airfield? So whenever you want to get information about the airport itself from a sectional chart, take a look, at the verbiage that's right down here for it. Runway length is something that's found on on typically the third or the fourth line, so either the last or the second to last line in these sections here. And right in the middle of that line, there should be two numbers. That's going to give you the length of the longest runway in hundreds of feet. So in this case, you can see it says 35, so that would be 3,500 feet, or A. The next one has us refer to an excerpt from what they call the chart supplements. Used to be a book called the Airports and Facilities Directory, but this one says refer to figure 52, and it asks, when is the Lincoln control tower in operation? So that's easy enough. So we can see here's the excerpt for Lincoln right here for us, all this information that we got right down here. If we want to see when the tower is operational, there's two ways we can do it. They're both very close to each other. We come all the way down here to where we see communications. You can see tower and then the frequencies that are there for those tower communications. And then in the parentheses, it gives you the operational times of the control tower. Also right below that, where it has the airspace designation, because it is Class C, it does have a control tower. They also then give you those hours of service right next to it as well. So as you can see, the answer will just take right from that, and it is B, from 1130 Zulu to 0600 Zulu. Okay, the next one is also asking us about Lincoln, and it just wants to know the tower frequency this time. So we can go right back to that same spot in communication where we saw tower. It has two frequencies there provided for us. Only one of these two appears as a possible answer, though, and you may see that on certain FAA questions where only one of a possible multiple correct answers is going to be shown in your options box. So in this case, we'll go with C. And say that it is 118.5. There we go. All right, next says question number 4, refer to figure 59, area 3. You've been hired to inspect the group of towers just west of Mount Corey. What airspace are you in, and what are the vertical limits of that airspace? So we've seen the FAA asking a lot more questions on the test recently related to the boundary where Class G uncontrolled airspace ends and Class E controlled airspace begins. And we're talking about the altitude boundary. So if you remember from your studies, typically we have that transition occur either at 700 feet above the ground or 1,200 feet above the ground, unless we have a Class E surface area where the Class E actually comes all the way down to the ground itself. So in this question, they want to know if we're inspecting these towers, based on their height, what class of airspace are we going to be flying in? So here's Mount Corey. Now we can see right in the center here, just south of that number 3 for area 3. And they're talking about the group of towers just to the west. So we can see those towers right over here. Now looking around, it doesn't give us the ideal situation, because usually we'd want to see a number in parentheses like this, right underneath the bigger number in bold for the towers, which gives the height of the tops in MSL, feet above sea level. The one in the parentheses, this is what gives us the height above the towers in AGL, feet above ground level, which is what we're interested in. So this one we don't have it, but if we look in the general vicinity, we see that there's a couple that are right around that 1,100 foot mark, and we can see that based on the heights of the towers themselves, it seems like if you're in the 1,100 foot range, you're somewhere in that 300 foot range. So since that's much lower than the 700 foot AGL, which is where in this case we would actually make this the transition, we can be pretty confident that we'll still be within that uncontrolled Class G airspace. But we know in this case that we make that transition at 700 feet AGL because these towers are located inside one of these thick magenta border regions. Okay, so you can see this one kind of looks like Mickey Mouse ears if you could see the whole thing. But because those towers are located on the inside of a vignetted, as they say magenta border, you're going to have the transition between uncontrolled Class G to controlled Class E occur at 700 feet AGL. All right. If the towers were outside, if they were somewhere over here on the dark side of that border, so the outer side, it would make the transition at 1200. Okay. So in this case, since we're going to be somewhere up around 300 feet or so, 300 to 400 feet, we'll say the flights will be in Class G airspace, and our answer is A. The Class G will extend up to 700 feet AGL. Okay, next, question number 5, refer to figure 59, area 3. What airspace lies above Schaller, the private airport? So this is also a question that relates to the Class E airspace, because Schaller, as we can see, located right here, and we find it inside a dashed magenta border, which if you remember from your studies, a dashed magenta border like this surrounding this airport that does not have a control tower, magenta airport icon, this indicates a surface area of Class E airspace. So we would say that we're based on Schaller's location, we're inside that border. So the airspace is Class E from the surface up to 17,999 feet MSL, because as you also probably recall from your studies, at 18,000 feet MSL, we're going to transition to the Class A or the Class Alpha airspace for the entire country, the entire national airspace system. Okay, next, question number 6, refer to figure 59, area 2. You've been hired to photograph a property 4 nautical miles to the east of New Bavaria. The weather is VFR and winds are calm. What hazard should you be particularly alert for in the area? Well, if I take a look to the west of New Bavaria, or I'm sorry, the east of New Bavaria is right down here. The first thing that catches my eye is I've got these 4 designators along this gray line right down here. And this is, if you remember from your preparations, this is how we denote what's called a military training route. So a route that military aircraft are routinely flying along. And the designators, because they all begin with the letters VR, means that the military aircraft will be flying under visual flight rules. And the fact that there are 4 numbers attached to each of them means that these routes exist at altitudes below 1,500 feet AGL. So the aircraft are flying below 1,500 feet above the ground. And in a lot of areas along these routes, they could be flying very low, even below our 400 foot above ground level normal maximum for unmanned aircraft flights. So the hazard here then would be A, these low flying aircraft operations being conducted under VFR conditions. Okay, next, question 7, refer to figure 69, area 3. The airspace associated with Corpus Christi International Airport is what? Well, this one's pretty simple. Here's Corpus Christi International. We see blue airport icon, means it has a control tower, so it has to have either B, C, or D airspace surrounding it. And then once we know that, we can remember that if we have these 2 solid magenta rings, like we see right here, that's how we denote Class C, or Charlie airspace, but they even make it even simpler with a lot of areas of Class B or Class C. They even print it right there on the map for you. We can see a little piece of that in this enlarged version in the corner. So our answer here is A, Class C. Okay, next, question 8, refer to figure 69, area 7. The airspace above Alice International is what? So this is another question that's going to ask us where do we see that transition from the Class G uncontrolled to the Class E airspace. So because Alice International, we can see it's a magenta icon, so we know there's no control tower there. I also don't see a dashed magenta border surrounding it, so we know it's not a surface area of Class E airspace, but it does fall within one of these thick vignetted magenta border regions. Okay, and remember what we said before, if you're on the inside of those thick magenta borders, we're going to have that transition from Class G uncontrolled to Class E controlled at 700 feet AGL. Now, interestingly enough, with this one, we don't see a Class G from the surface to 700 AGL as an option. We've got surface to 1,200, which would be the case if the airport was outside of this thick border. We've got to 14,000, which isn't anything. And then we've got Class G from the surface to 878 feet MSL. Now, this is an interesting example because, again, this is something that the FAA has been doing with a lot of these questions. They're expecting us for this one to give the answer for where that boundary is at 700 feet AGL as the MSL equivalent, okay, or as the feet above sea level equivalent. So to do this, if we look at the verbiage here for Alice International, we see that on this third line down, we've got a number here on the left that's in italics. This is going to give us the height of the terrain above sea level where this airport is built, okay? So since the terrain at Alice International is 178 feet above sea level, if we add 178 to our boundary line of 700 feet AGL, that's where we get this answer C as our correct choice, Class G from the surface to 878 feet MSL, which is that equivalent altitude for 700 AGL in the region. Okay, so again, they're getting a little tricky. They're getting a little demanding with your knowledge of these things as far as the transition from Class G to Class E. So make sure that you're comfortable with some of these questions. All right. Next, question 9, refer to figure 1. The definition of A is what? So here we can see we've got A, and it looks like A is referencing an angle between the chord line of the wing. That's like the cross section of the airfoil. And then the oncoming, what they call relative wind, or the actual air that's flowing over this wing or rotor blade itself. So that is actually the definition of what we call angle of attack. Okay, so if you see this figure and they talk about referencing A, the angle between the chord line of the wing and the oncoming relative wind, that is the definition for angle of attack. Okay. All right, next we'll take a look at some weather questions. So this one says, refer to figure 12, using the information provided. What is the current dew point at LAX? So these are some what we call METARs that have to be decoded for certain questions on the exam. So they want to know about LAX, that's our third one down, and specifically they want to know about the dew point. Okay, so as you remember from your studies, we get our temperature and dew point in these METARs if we go all the way over to the fraction that we see near the end. So temperature comes first, then we have dew point, and always in degrees Celsius. Okay, so we look at the bottom number there, and we would answer as A. The current dew point is 15 degrees Celsius. All right, let's move right along. So this one says, referencing the METARs, what is the ceiling at KMDW, Chicago's Midway Airport? So here's KMDW, and they want to know what the ceiling is. So that refers to clouds and cloud coverage. So in aviation terminology, ceiling is defined as the lowest layer of clouds reported as being either broken or overcast. So let's make our way across and see where we come to something that might indicate broken or overcast. All right, so here we go. So right here, a little bit past that midway point, we see OVC. That stands for overcast, and then the numbers give us the height of the clouds in hundreds of feet AGL. So the overcast layer, that's the lowest, being reported as broken or overcast. I don't see any broken indicators here at all. And 700 feet. So we just add our 2 zeros to the end. And remember AGL. So our answer here is B. Okay, question number 12 says, refer to figure 15. You've received an authorization to conduct a tower inspection flight in Memphis International Airport's Class B airspace. Due to weather, you had to reschedule your planned flight to 0300 Zulu on the 13th. Based on the TAF report, so we're going to take a look at it, what's called a terminal aerodrome forecast. Can you expect to be able to proceed with the flight under normal Part 107 regulations? All right, so let's look at this one in terms of weather. The proposed time is 0300 Zulu on the 13th. All right, so here's our TAF report, and here the top one is the one for Memphis, KMEM. Whenever we're answering this question, we want to look for what weather conditions are expected at a particular date and time. So the top line, when we get to the fraction right here, this tells us the valid period. So this tells us that it will run from the 12th at 1800 Zulu until the 13th at 2400. All right, and we want to know what specifically will be occurring on the 13th at 0300. All right, so to find that out, we start coming down here to these lower lines, which we call the forecast change group. So when you see the FM, you just read that as from. Okay, if you see becoming, you read it just like that, becoming. And if you ever see tempo, then you'll read it the same way. There's going to be a temporary fluctuation, which is an example of that right down here. Okay, so the first one says from 2200, so that would be a few hours after the report took effect, because it took effect on the 12th at 1800. And then it gives us some conditions. The next one says from 0200. All right, so that means we've passed midnight. Now we're going into the AM and the next day. So that is the 13th. All right, and then the next one says becoming on the 13th at 10 to the 13th at 12. So this is after our window, because we want the 13th at 0300. So we're going to go with this line right here, and we're going to start making our way across and looking for weather things that would prevent us from flying. Well, in the sky conditions, it says overcast at 800 feet. Well, depending on the height of the tower, if the tower is 300 feet or less, we could still fly all the way up to the top and still have our 500-foot separation that we're required to maintain. So that's not a no-go. But if you go a little further, you get to visibility, and it states that the visibility is expected to be 2 statute miles. So that's below our minimum of 3 statute miles. So for this one, we're going to go back and say, no, we're not going to be able to expect to be able to proceed, because the visibility is forecast at being too low. All right, so refer to figure 20, area 1. You've been hired by ESPN to shoot a water event being held 1 mile north of Norfolk Naval Air Station Chambers Field. At what altitude does the controlled airspace begin in this area? So this is one where you've got to be a little, they're a little sneaky with it, I guess. But you just got to make sure you look carefully. So here's Chambers Field. You can see in the blown up version, and a lot of people at first glance, all they see is the fact that we've got these solid magenta rings, which indicates Class C airspace, and they see a fraction in this particular little ring that says 40/20, which we know when we're dealing with shelf areas for Class B and Class C airspace, the bottom number gives you the lower boundary of the controlled airspace for that class, and then the top one gives you the upper boundary, and these are again in hundreds of feet MSL. So a lot of people initially think that the answer here should be maybe 2,000 feet MSL, but that's not an answer. That's over here. Mostly, we see that there is actually another border in here. It's a dashed blue border that goes around that second ring, and that's because Norfolk Naval Air Station, it is a blue airport icon as well, meaning it has its own control tower, and this dashed blue border with this number here in the 4-corner box, this is how we indicate Class D or Class Delta controlled airspace, which also, like any towered airport, when you're in the surface area itself, right around the airport, will start at the surface. Okay, so the answer for this one is that the controlled airspace is Class D, and it does actually begin all the way down at the ground. Okay, question 14, refer to figure 20, area 5. You've been hired to inspect a large tower with high intensity lights located to the south of the glider port at Cotton Gin Private Airport. What is the maximum altitude you can fly while we are inspecting this tower? So this one, they like to ask a lot of these tower-based questions, because we know that if we are flying within a 400-foot radius of any man-made structure, we can fly all the way up to the top of that structure plus another 400 feet above the top. So they like to give us these to do a little bit of math and and figure out where that boundary line is. So here's the glider port up at Cotton Gym, this private airfield right here. And just south of that, we see this big, tall, swooping icon with the little lightning bolts coming out of the top. The lightning bolts is how we indicate the high intensity lights, okay? And we can see at the numbers that are here right next to it, because of its shape, this big, tall, swooping design, we know that its height has to be at least 1,000 feet tall, at least 1,000 feet above ground level. And we can see that, yes, those numbers there match up. So the absolute height of the structure, its height above ground level, that's the one in parentheses, 1,041 feet. Okay, so if we add on our extra 400 feet to this that we can go up, if we stay within that 400-foot radius, we would get an answer of B, our maximum altitude, 1,441 feet AGL. Okay. Next, refer to Figure 21, Area 1. You've been hired to inspect the train tracks east of Lone Tree up to the tank farm. Minnow International Tower is operational. What airspace will you be flying in during your inspection? All right, well, let's take a look and see what borders we cross here. So we're going to start out up here in Lone Tree, and we're outside of all the borders in the area that would indicate surface areas of controlled airspace, okay? So I'm going to start to move my way along the train tracks. That's this solid black line with our little hash marks here. So here we go. I'm making my way down. Here I am going to cross a dashed magenta border that surrounds Minnow. This is for an area of Class E surface airspace that extends out beyond the Class D, which is our blue circle here, for different instrument approach and departure corridors around this airport. So we are here going to make a transition from uncontrolled Class G to controlled Class E, okay, as we come down here. But then we're going to stop when we get to the tank farm. We're not going to go any further. So we're not actually going to cross the blue border for Class D. So for this one, we're going to say the correct answer is Class G. And then once we cross that dashed magenta, then we will be in a surface area of Class E. Okay, next, question 16. Refer to Figure 21. So this one's one of our questions where we have to use our latitude and longitude coordinates to find something first, and then we can answer our question. So this one says you've been hired to inspect a tower located at 47 degrees 39 minutes north latitude by 101 degrees 32 minutes west longitude. What airspace will you be initially flying in, and what is the vertical limit of that airspace? Okay, so let's take a look here at this one. So I'm going to start off with our latitude component. Okay, so here's a 48 degree line of latitude running east to west up here. All right, and that means that the 47 degree line, since we're in the northern hemisphere here in North America, 47 is going to be somewhere off the page that we can't see, somewhere down here, because this next line, this is the 30-minute line. So this would be 47 degrees. 47 degrees 30 minutes north would be right here. We want to get to 47 degrees 39 minutes. Okay, so we can start here at this 30-minute line for 47:30, and then we're just going to count these little tick marks as we keep making our way north up to that 48 line. All right, so if this is 47 degrees 30 minutes, then we need to count up an additional 9. Okay, so we're going to go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. So right around here where it says Lake Nettie Wildlife Refuge. Then we got to get our longitude coordinates. So here's 101, the line running north to south, and we want 101 degrees 32 minutes west. Okay, so we're going to keep moving west because we're in the western hemisphere. So we're going to hit the 102 line somewhere off the page out here. This next whole line that we come to, though, that is our 30-minute mark. So this is 101 degrees 30 minutes longitude. And then if we go another 2 minutes along this line right here, 1, 2, there we go. That's our coordinate then for the 101 degrees 32 minutes west. So now if we cross-reference these two locations, I'm going to bring this one down until we are in line with Lake Nettie Wildlife Refuge. So right there, we can see here is the tower that is in question, this little lone tower right here to the west of Garrison. And we see that this structure is located within one of those thick magenta border regions. So we know that if we're inside, as we've talked about already, we're going to transition to the Class E airspace at 700 feet above the ground. And this tower is 297 feet. Okay, so if we're flying it up to 297 feet, then we're not going all the way up to 700. So we're going to say that the answer here is B. It will be within Class G airspace, and that airspace exists up to 700 feet before we make that transition to Class E. Okay, next, refer to Figure 22, Area 3. You've been hired by a private pilot to video his airplane taxiing out to the runway at Shoshone County Airfield. Who must you contact for permission? Well, for this one, I see a magenta airport icon, which means no control tower. I don't see any borders around this airport that would indicate a surface area of Class E airspace. So that means that initially up to at least 700 feet, in this case, it actually looks like it'll be up to 1,200 feet AGL, we're going to be in uncontrolled Class G airspace. So if you're doing a flight in uncontrolled airspace, then based on the regulations, you do not need to contact anyone. All right, so our answer here is C. Even though it takes place at the airport with the airplane taxiing out, you do not need an authorization for that flight when conducted under Part 107 as a remote pilot certificate holder. But that still does not exempt us from our responsibility to make sure that every aspect of that flight is conducted safely in a controlled manner that does not interfere with any type of manned aircraft flying in and out of that facility. So it does still put a complex flight profile and a complex responsibility on our shoulders if you would be operating on an airfield itself. Okay, next, question 18, refer to Figure 23, Area 3. You've been hired to inspect a 1,534-foot tower located approximately 8 miles southwest of Savannah Hilton Head International Airport. What airspace will you be operating in to complete the inspection, and will an airspace authorization be required? So this one really shows you how our airspace kind of starts to stack up on each other. So we can see here's Savannah Hilton Head. We can see that it's surrounded by these solid magenta two rings, these concentric rings, which we know indicates Class C airspace. And if we come out here, this is the tower, this big tall one with our high intensity lights that we match up with this set of numbers here indicating the tallest structure, 1,534 feet. So this tower set is located beneath this shelf area of the Class C airspace. We can see that here based on its position between these two borders. But if we look down here, we see that we are actually going to hit the bottom of that shelf area at 1,300 feet MSL. Okay, so let's keep that in mind as we start going up to this total height of this tower, because we see its total height above sea level, 1,548 feet MSL. All right, so initially we're going to start off on the ground. We're below all the controlled airspace initially, so we're initially in Class G airspace. We're going to start climbing up, and we see that on this outer border for the shelf area for the Class C, it also has one of those thick faded magenta borders. Okay, so that means that then at 700 feet, since we're inside that thick magenta border, we're going to go from the Class G uncontrolled to the Class E controlled airspace. Okay, so at 700 we make the transition. Now it's Class E airspace. But if we're just going into Class E because of altitude, if we stay around the structure, we don't need any authorizations. Okay, so I'm still going to keep going on up. But once we hit 1,300 MSL, and we're still not at the top since this one goes all the way up to 1,548 feet MSL, then we are actually going to enter the shelf area of the Class C airspace around Savannah Hilton Head. And at that point, based on the letter of the law and our regulations, yes, if we were then going to fly into that Class C airspace, we would require an authorization. So for this one, we actually hit 3 different types of airspace: Class G, then E, then C, because of its height. And since we are going to end up in Class C, yes, the regulation says we need an authorization for a flight in that region. Okay, next, question 19. Refer to figure 24, area 5. You've been hired by a farmer to inspect crops 1 mile west of Hidden Springs Private Airfield. You'll be using a fixed-wing drone at an altitude of 400 feet AGL. What airspace will you be operating in, and what are the vertical limits of that airspace? All right, so here's another example we can look at. So here's Hidden Springs, and we're looking about a mile to the west. Again, puts us firmly inside our thick magenta border region, meaning that we're going to have that transition from Class G to Class E at 700 feet AGL. This one says we're flying at 400 feet AGL, so that's pretty clear. The answer then is B. We'll be in Class G airspace, and the transition line is 700 AGL. All right, let's go back to this one. Refer to figure 25, area 4. What airspace lies above Fort Worth Alliance in area 4? So here's one of our layered airspace situations, which is fairly common if you have an area where you have Class B airspace for the big internationals, all these solid blue borders radiating out from Dallas-Fort Worth, which is going to be somewhere under here, just off our excerpt. You have areas, smaller towered airports with Class D airspace nestled in under these shelf areas. Okay, so if you get a question like this where they're asking you about any of these surrounding airports with smaller airports with control towers that have these Class D areas of airspace surrounding them, you're going to expect this layered situation that we're going to see here. All right, so if we look at Fort Worth Alliance, we can see blue airport icon, control tower, dashed blue border going around it. That means Class D. So we're going to start with the controlled Class D at the surface, and then if we look at this little number here in the four corner box, we see it says -30. So that means that the Class D goes up to but does not include 3,000 feet MSL, because at 3,000 feet MSL, we're going to make the transition to the Class B airspace in those shelf areas for the bigger international airport. And as we can see then from our fractions in this area, the top number in the fraction 110. So that means that we'll go from 3,000 feet MSL up to 11,000 feet MSL for the Class B airspace at that point. So our answer here then is going to be B, Class D from the surface up to but not including 3,000 MSL, and then Class B from 3,000 MSL to 11,000 MSL for that airspace above Fort Worth Alliance. Okay, question 21, refer to figure 25, area 4. What is the field elevation of Fort Worth Alliance? So this is just another one of these data questions. So we take a look here at the verbiage. As we talked about before, we go down to either the third or the fourth line in this verbiage, and we look for that number that's on the left-hand side in italics. Here we see it's 722, so that means that the terrain where Fort Worth Alliance is built, 722 feet above sea level, or 722 feet MSL. All right, next, refer to figure 26, area 2. Where does the controlled airspace begin above Cooperstown Airport? So again, Cooperstown is inside the thick magenta border, so we know that we're going to have that transition to the controlled Class E at 700 feet. We've talked about it multiple times so far. Now, I don't see a 700-foot AGL answer, though. So again, as we saw in that earlier example, if I go down here to the elevation of the terrain for Cooperstown, 1,424 feet, and I add my 700-foot AGL to this one to get to that boundary line, so 1,424 plus 700, I get an equivalent altitude of 2,124 feet MSL as that boundary line where we're going to make that transition to the controlled Class E. Okay, so again, don't get thrown off. Don't be surprised if they try and ask you to give that MSL equivalent. Okay, question 23, refer to figure 26, area 5. What is the longitude and latitude of Barnes County Airport? Okay, so here's Barnes County, and this one, we're fortunate, we're pretty close to our 2 whole degree lines right here. So here's a 47-degree line of latitude, and remember, I got to work my way down here to get in line with Barnes County, so I'm actually going to be subtracting these minutes off of 60, and my final final coordinate will actually be 46 degrees and so many minutes. So I'm going to say 1, 2, 3. Let's round it up to about 4 minutes that we'll take off. So 60 minus 4 gives us 56. So then the latitude coordinate will be 46 degrees, 56 minutes north. And then here's my 98-degree line of longitude. I'm going to go maybe 1 minute here to the west to get in line with Barnes County. So then longitude 98 degrees, 1 minute west. So our correct answer, if we look at our options, is going to be B. Okay, next. So here's one that has also been giving a lot of folks some difficulties, much like those boundary questions between our controlled and our uncontrolled airspace with our G and E areas. This one says, refer to figure 24 in area 6, and it says, while monitoring the Commerce Airport CTAF, you hear an aircraft announce that they are midfield on a left downwind to runway 36. Where would the aircraft be in relation to the airport? Okay, so a couple ways that you can work this one out, and I've worked with a lot of students in trying to figure out the easiest way to figure these guys out. Probably the easiest way that I've seen anyway, and at least the way that I look at it, once they identify the runway for you. So this one says runway 36. Okay, remember that the runway number is the magnetic heading of the runway. Okay, so if I put a 0 on that, that means 360 or north. Okay, so to touch down, when the plane's actually descending to land on final approach, if they look at the compass in their plane, it should correspond to the heading of the runway that they intend to land on. So they should be flying in a northerly direction. All right, so if I come over here then to Commerce, that means that if I'm going to be flying on a northerly direction on final approach, I'm going to be coming from down here, flying up this way to touch down on this end of the runway. Okay, so once I know that, all right, so I'm going to be coming this direction to touch down right here. Then all I really need to do is backtrack. Okay, so it says it's a left-hand pattern. So it says left downwind, and we know that the downwind leg is run parallel to the runway itself. Okay, so we're either going to be over here going parallel, or we're going to be over here going parallel. But since it's a left-hand traffic pattern, and we're going to be landing coming up this way to touch down on runway 36, if we just backtrack it, then we would see that the correct answer is going to be over here or west, because they're going to be flying down the downwind. All right, then they're going to make a left-hand turn, their left, not ours. All right, left-hand turn here onto the base leg, and then one last left-hand turn onto final approach to touch down while heading in that northerly direction on runway 36. Okay. So I know it's a lot of steps to look at there, but we've got a few other versions of that question in our practice test bank. So, make sure you take a look at those and then, try and use that trick and just backtrack from there. So correct answer is C. Okay, next, this one says, refer to figure 23, area 1. Where does the controlled airspace begin above Hampton, Varnville? So again, one of those boundary questions. This one's different though, because now Hampton, Varnville is located on the outer side. So it's located outside one of these thick magenta border regions. And when we're on the outside of those areas, we're actually going to have that transition from uncontrolled class G to controlled class E a little bit higher. We're going to make the transition at 1,200 feet AGL as opposed to 700. Okay. Now looking over here though, all the possible answers that they have for us are all given as MSL equivalents. So if we come in here and we go down, in this case, it's the third line because the last line is our communication frequency for Hampton Barnville. The number here on the left, 113, 113 feet, that is the height of the terrain above sea level. If I add 113 to 1,200 AGL, I get an equivalent altitude of 1,313 feet MSL. Okay, so there you go. We hit a bunch of those. The last question we have for you, question 26. According to Title 14 of the Code of Federal Regulations, Part 107, the responsibility to inspect the small unmanned aircraft system to ensure it is in a safe operating condition rests with the who. So 99% of the responsibility questions that you get on this test the correct answer is going to be you as the remote pilot in command, the person that actually holds that remote pilot certificate. Okay, there's only one responsibility question that you may see where you have a different requirement. So anything that has to do with the actual operation of the aircraft and the safety of the operation of the aircraft comes down to the pilot in command. Anything that has to do with documents of record that are required for airworthiness, like your registration document, things like that, that one is the responsibility of the owner of the aircraft. Okay, but this one's talking about the actual operations, the inspection of the aircraft for safety prior to flight. That is a responsibility that will always rest with that pilot in command. Okay. All right, so that takes us to the end of our guided question section. But Alicia, it looks like we had maybe a couple folks that typed in questions into the chat box there.
Yeah, thanks, Colin. Would you be able to go back to question 24
Sure.
and just review that answer?
Yeah. Yeah, no problem. Yeah, this one's tricky. So again, difficult to explain different ways that we can look at this. But I'll run through it again the way that I typically do it. So first thing I do, I identify the runway that they say they're landing on. Okay, so runway 36. So remember then when they're flying down for touchdown on runway 36, when they're on that final approach leg of the traffic pattern, they will be flying the same heading as the runway. Okay, so they'll be flying a heading of 360 degrees, or they'll be flying towards the north. Okay, so that means they're going to be coming from down here, flying north to touch it down on this end of the runway. They can't be coming to touchdown on this end of the runway, because if they're flying north and they're up here, they're already going the opposite direction. Okay, so they have to be touching down on this one. All right, so this means this is the final approach leg of the traffic pattern. Okay, we also then know that they're on the downwind leg. That's what they tell us in the communication. So downwind means they're parallel to the runway, so they're either over here or over here. And then the last piece of information that we need is that it is a left-hand traffic pattern. Okay, so all turns in that traffic pattern to get to that final approach route down here, coming up to touchdown right here, they're all going to be turns to the left. Okay, so then you just have to pretend like you're the little pilot in the airplane, and we're flying down this way on our downwind leg. We're heading south. Okay, then we make a left-hand turn, from our perspective in the airplane, right here on the base leg, and then another left-hand turn onto final approach, where we see that heading of 360 on our compass, and we touch down at that end of the runway. So it takes a few steps to get through them, and those are difficult, especially if you're not familiar with looking at those, in that regard, and listening to these communications. But the good news is there's not a ton of those questions on the test. At most, people say they get maybe a couple of them. Some people say they don't see any of them. So just in the luck of the draw, you can see where you're at. But it's not a make or break question. But there you go. That's another run through.
Thanks. And then as you were going through that, someone also commented, how do we know downwind is north, or how do we know what downwind is?
I see. So my recommendation there is make sure you go back into your study material and review the standard box traffic pattern. Okay, because that's what they're referring to here, is whenever airplanes are flying around these smaller non-towered airports, they follow what's called a standard box traffic pattern. So downwind, base, crosswind, those are all legs of the traffic pattern. So that's what we're referring to when we say downwind. We're talking about that particular leg of the pattern. So I don't have any good diagrams to show you right here, but if you do a quick little Google search, type in box traffic pattern aircraft, something like that, or airport, you'll find some that will show you a nice diagram. Plus, in our materials, if you go into that airport operations section, that's where we cover the diagram with all the legs of the pattern.
Great, thanks. So those were the only questions that we received through the chat section. Does anyone else have other questions that you'd like to just call out or submit in the chat section? And if there's no other questions right now, we will just wrap things up. And like I mentioned in the beginning, I'll I'll be sending out a recording of the full webinar as well as a copy of the slide deck. So I'll be emailing all of that out within the next hour or two. So keep an eye out for that. And then if any other questions do come up, please feel free to email us or call us, and we'd be happy to help you out. So that's it for today, but thank you guys for joining us, and thank you to Colin, and good luck on your exams.
Thanks, everyone. Have a great day.